Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. Welcome to the show. I'm super happy to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to do this.
We're going to talk about a lot of topics today, but the thing that I think we're going to be getting into is about building great leadership teams. And honestly, you're the first person I think of with this topic. I've learned a lot from you on this topic.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. I thought we would just start maybe with some kind of basics. Let's start with just like introducing yourself a little bit. Do you mind telling about yourself and how you got to where you're at today?
Yeah, so my name is Alex Kroman, and I am currently the Chief Product and Technology Officer at LivePerson. So I manage the product management and engineering teams at LivePerson. LivePerson is a conversation platform between brands and consumers. Prior to that, I worked with Jade at New Relic in a variety of engineering and product roles. And prior to that, I spent the early part of my career as a software engineer working at a variety of startups.
Awesome. When you think about leaders and when you're looking for leaders, like what do you view the role of the leader as being? And how do you define what a leader does? What does a leader do?
You know, in terms of my definition of leadership, I really think of leaders as people who create a vision, which is a future state, and they rally a group of people to achieve that vision. And so I think it's really this combination of both creating a vision for the future and how to communicate that and inspire that to ensure that that vision is something that is worth building and will really move the goals of the company forward. But then at the same time, creating and bringing along a group of people to actually build that and make that a reality. So that's the overall definition of leadership that I usually think about.
When you're hiring other leaders, how do you go about that? What do you look for in other leaders?
In terms of hiring people, I'm really looking for those two qualities. I want to hear from people about what they've built. You know, we're on a tech podcast here, and you might be looking for different things in different fields, but in technology, whether it's engineering or product management, I really want to hear about what is a vision that you had, why was that important, and how did you see that contributing to the company, and then how did you actually get it built? How did you assemble people to work on it? How did you define progress, set objectives, and make sure that the product that was being built was amazing and high quality? And I think some people will focus too much on the vision piece and not enough on the building and execution piece, or even vice versa. But really looking to understand those two qualities. And I think a few lessons that I've learned that maybe aren't important in terms of hiring leaders are things that are just not always related to the process of building and shipping product. So I think there is a lot of surface quality issues that I think a lot of people look for in leaders, whether it's somebody who has amazing public speaking skills or is super charismatic or gives all of the toasts at a company dinner. And we have this stereotype of leaders being a certain way. And there are amazing leaders who have those qualities, but the core quality is really that ability to set a vision and build something and get something done. And I think when you're looking for leaders, you really have to avoid those surface qualities of leadership and really hone in on the core of it.
I'm curious how you have come to think about leadership teams or how you have learned about building leadership teams over time. Like when you think back to earlier in your career, How did you learn about putting leadership teams together?
I think a lot of that learning came from early in my career managing engineering teams and working at startups, building, hiring up that core engineering team and building that initial product. And I think a lot of that was influenced by the startup world and moving incredibly quickly, shipping something every day, really customer focused and things like that. And I think that was where really a lot of my, really how I spent a lot of time earlier in my career. And I think when you get promoted or you move up to this next level of managing managers, I see a mistake that a lot of people take is that they really go into that role with this kind of coaching mindset of just, I've got other engineering managers reporting to me. I'm going to just hire good people and let them do their own thing. And I think that is a really dangerous approach as your first job as a director. And actually, Paul Graham, have you read the founder mode versus manager mode article?
Yeah, I just read it very recently and actually did a podcast on it just a few days ago.
Oh,
So
nice.
it probably hasn't come out. But that was exactly the conclusion I came to. Is that's terrible advice for any leader.
Yeah, it's the worst advice. And I think there is things I disagree with in that article, but I think the core of it of managers, professional managers, often just hiring good people and letting them do their work. I think it's some of the worst advice that has happened in the tech industry. And what I always think is important is really figuring out what you're building. And you can run your leadership team as a director really in a very similar way that you run an engineering team, where again you have this vision of this future state that you're working towards, and you create that, you talk about it, and you create a plan to get there, and you work with the other managers and their teams to get there. And I think it's really important when you're a manager to be part of something that is so much bigger than your own team. Like you have your own team, you're building something on that team, but you also want to be building towards something bigger and better. And it's really the responsibility, in my opinion, of your manager to create and paint that picture of what is that bigger thing that you are working towards, not just individually, but in concert with a larger group of people. And those could be people that are reporting to a common manager, but it could be people across the company, because cross-functional leadership teams are incredibly important as well.
Can you tell me a little bit, like you've seen so many different leadership teams in your career, and when you're looking at a leadership team, how do you know if it's doing well or not? How do you know if it's a good leadership team?
I think there's a few questions that you can either ask or observe to get a sense of maybe where that team is on their leadership team journey. One very simple question is, what are you all building? Like, what are you all working towards? And I think if you get answers that are just very specific to what the individual manager is doing versus your overall group, I think that's a classic sign of just siloing and not really working together as a group. I think there's behavior of the team that you can observe as well. I think one thing that you see in leadership teams that aren't working very well is just not a lot of time spent together. You see a lot of organizations where there isn't even a team meeting. It's just one-on-one. There might not be one-on-one meetings, but there might just be one-on-one meetings. And I think one of the definitions of being a team is that you actually work on things together. It doesn't have to be in a meeting. It could be in Slack channels. It could be up there talking to customers and selling the product or whatever it is. But you actually have to spend time together. And And the reason people spend time together is that they're trying to build something really great. And so you can see that as part of it. So there's a shared vision of where people are going, and they work together to do that. And it's really the same things that you look for whenever you're trying to figure out if an engineering team is working well together. But for some reason, people don't generally think about teams of leaders ever working together. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I think a lot of what I think about is just applying a lot of the same techniques that you use to build products on small teams with groups of leaders.
It's funny you say that, because I feel like thinking about leadership teams is actually kind of underrepresented in what we talk about in leadership circles. And when I look around, I think of like very effective leadership teams as being actually pretty uncommon. Do you agree that that's uncommon? And if so, why do you think that is?
I do think it's pretty uncommon to see. And I think it's interesting. I think when I've worked with other organizations, I think there's plenty of organizations that have strong engineering teams and maybe weak leadership teams, but I've generally not seen the opposite, where there's really strong leadership teams and weak engineering teams, which I think is fascinating. I think at the root of this is that there are a lot of people in management positions that aren't really trying to build something and don't have that shared vision. And even when you ask them about it, they'll say, my vision is to build the roadmap that a product manager gives to me. And that to me is just not really a leadership role. The core thing missing is really stepping back and figuring out, what is it that my team is going to build? What is the purpose of it? Like, why am I in this job? It's not a job worth having if all you're doing is giving some advice here and there or writing a performance review. Like, you've got a collection of people. What are you going to build with it? And I think not having that strength of vision and the conviction to make it happen has turned a lot of essentially middle managers into kind of bureaucracy and paperwork. And I think we see that playing out across the industry, because that group of people has been hit super, super hard in layoffs over the last few years. My biggest advice to people is just to spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to build. And when you do that and you have this clear picture of what you're building, the tactics of how to do that become clear. It's not so much about advising somebody on what they're building on their team, but actually using those tools and techniques that you used as a frontline manager with your team itself to get things done.
Can you talk a little bit more about the translation of the vision into how you cohere your leadership team around that vision? Like, there's something about the vision setting that actually can happen with you as an individual. But when you're building a leadership team around that vision, how do you see the mechanics of that?
Yeah. When people say the word vision, it often is a very scary word that can go off into all sorts of different directions. But I think it can be really a lot simpler than that, and it often can just be related like the main reason maybe you got hired for the position or got moved into the job. I mean, I'm thinking about a strong leadership team that I was working with recently, and their vision was really simple. It was to move the entire platform that they were working on into Kubernetes. Pretty basic, pretty like simple vision. There's nothing really groundbreaking there, but it was completely unifying, and it was something that people were excited about. It was like a problem that all the leaders felt like was worth working towards, and it was something they all had to work on together. And I really think it's just providing, it doesn't have to be complex, something that can be published externally and like really turn heads. It can be a pretty simple thing. But even just distilling a very simple vision whether it's cloud migration, improving reliability, improving the user. We're going to have a great user experience. You can, and obviously you can build on that a little bit, but even simple visions, I think, can be like really catalyzing forces for teams, because in any business, there's just so many things coming at you from all sorts of directions. And it can be, the default mode is just working a little bit on everything that people are saying. And so you need to really consolidate and unify around the thing that is most important. And I think that's the job of the leader of the team.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I learned from you was basically the trick. I call it a trick, but was the idea that if you want to create a strong leadership team, you make sure that they're working on solving problems together.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like kind of an automatic way to make a team out of a group of leaders. If you're solving problems together, you're a team, almost definitionally. Does that sound familiar, or am I making that up?
That does sound like something I would have said. But yeah, I think that is like a really great tactic where, if you're looking to make progress, maybe you're in a new role, maybe you don't have a vision established yet. The quickest and easiest thing to do is to figure out the main problems on the team that are shared. This is always extremely easy to figure out because you just ask people and everyone says the exact same things. It's definitely not rocket science. And then you just sequence those problems and you work on solving them as a team. And I think when I've applied this approach in the past, again, it's like really simple. Some of the problems that people bring up are very simple problems that are very quick to solve, but it's things that an individual person can't solve. It's things that the team themselves have to solve. And when people see just how easy it is to solve some of these problems that make their lives better, the lives of their teams better, make it easier to ship great product, it starts gelling why a leadership team is important. And so, yeah, I think that's a really, really great approach to getting started with a group of leaders.
When you move into a new leadership position, do you have a set of steps or actions that you take?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think whenever you get a new job, it is super important to spend some time gathering information. And so I definitely maybe will send out a survey. I'll do some one-on-one meetings across the company, certainly not limiting myself to just direct reports, because you want to hear from a broad of a voice as possible. And I think the questions to me that are important to ask in those early meetings are, the first question that comes to mind is, what is something that you don't want me to mess up? And it's a variation of what's going well. But I think it's important to say what's messing up, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that you can make as a leader is to break something that is already working well. And so you want to make sure that the changes that you're making are productive. So the first question is, what don't you want me to mess up? And then I think the second question is really about what are the problems that are preventing you from going faster? And the reason I ask the question in that way is, one is, as we just talked about, like building up that list of problems that the team works on is super important. But I really like couching that in terms of going faster, because I really feel like in most companies, there's just so many things that are in place that are preventing people from moving fast. And no matter what direction you end up going with the strategy, if the teams are moving faster, like that will be an improvement. So you don't even have to be super deep into the product or the company yet. But if you're making changes that help engineers move faster, they'll both appreciate that, and no matter what you're trying to do, it'll be helpful. So I'll start off asking people about those two questions. And then the next thing I like to do is really bring this leadership team, this team that I'm trying to form, together, ideally in person, but virtual works as well. And what I actually try to do is really work on the vision of what we're doing together as a team and the first list of problems that we're going to solve. And usually I will, based on the discussions I've had earlier with people, I'll come in with like my own straw person of what I think that should be, and then we'll work on that together. And what I tell people, because I really believe in being super transparent, is that the work that we produce in this offsite, we're going to talk to our teams about it then tomorrow or the next day, and really let people know the leadership team met. Here is the main thing that we're working on, the main problems we're trying to solve. Maybe we can articulate goals by then as well. And so I think that kind of idea of let's come together and essentially ship a piece of strategy that like in a few hours that we can deliver to everyone on our teams the next day is, I think, a good forcing function. And it helps create this idea that like you can build lightweight strategies and plans in just a few hours. Like you don't need a multi-quarter planning process or something like that. Like you can just get the ideas out on the table and move forward, and you can adjust a month later. And I think that kind of quickness and speed and just getting the team to cohere quickly that's how I'll generally approach it.
It sounds to me like it's very similar to bootstrapping with software, where
Yeah.
the intention is to ship something quickly that gets your kind of leadership like cycles going, so you can learn from that and iterate and deliver value. And as somebody that's coming in, it helps you learn about your leadership team. It helps you improve your leadership team. It also, you start shaping the organization you're a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that iterative delivery model for a leadership team is super important. You know, really coming in at the beginning of the week, figuring out what the most important things for that team to get done. And they have a lot of other things to do as well. So like but figuring out what the most important things for that team to get done, talking about that as a team, and then checking in at the end of the week or at the end of the day, depending on your cadence, I think is really important. And I think a lot of engineers have this feeling that like managers aren't doing anything. And in some ways that can sometimes be true, honestly. And so what I want to really do, I mean, obviously they're doing something, but like what I really want to do though is like change management into this like delivery craft where it's like, no, like here is the list of things that we're doing, and they either got done or they didn't get done, and create that sort of week by week, I guess, accountability, but to also just to make the organization, the product better, and really keep track of that day to day.
I've been a part of your leadership teams before, and so I have something to contrast with many other leadership teams I've been a part of. And I would say like probably one of the most common models that I've seen for leadership is what I call a hub and spoke model, where there's like a central person. They interact with their leaders kind of one-on-one. You alluded to this earlier. And the leadership team itself doesn't actually have very much they don't have very much in common. They don't have shared problems together. They're mostly working in their lane, and they may interact with each other on a project basis or something. That seems to be like the most common thing that I've seen. When you look at like how you set up your leadership teams and how the people like work together on problems, I think that's actually what I've seen. From what I've seen, it's a little bit unusual. Like you have a way of getting people to like cohere around a problem and work on it together. So I was just curious about how you think about that part of the process.
Yeah, I definitely think that hub and spoke model is the default for most organizations. And I think that is very much coming from the hierarchy that is causing that hub and spoke. And I think for me, I think my personality honestly just does not respect hierarchies, and I don't even feel like that is in general like the most efficient way to organize. I think the most important problems that a company needs to solve are rarely solvable by the end nodes of a hierarchy. And so, if you want to create the most value possible, you have to unite people together. And you also often have to unite people together around, or I should say, across organizational boundaries. And so I think my work in general, it hasn't. I've never spent much time thinking about how do I preserve the corporate hierarchy and make sure that information is passed up and down those layers in a certain way. I've always thought about what is the most important problem for the company to solve and really spending a lot of time thinking about that. And then the next question, of course, is who is the group of people that can best solve that? And so that's part of my approach. And I think in general, teams can do a lot more things than an individual can. And so if you're only managing people one by one, you can only do so much, but you can get so much more done when you're actually able to harness the output of a collective group. And so I think by really starting with what's the biggest problem I can solve for the company, and then figuring out like who are the people who can solve it, I think that that approach has helped me break out of that model a bit. And it also, I think, can be fun to be a part of because everyone on the team has a shared purpose. Like they all know that this is a huge problem, and like they're excited to finally build it or work on it.
Yeah, it actually makes the job of leadership a lot more fun when you have all these co-conspirators.
Exactly.
There's another part of this that, again, this is something I learned a lot from you about, which is that other leaders can often offer you critique or improve your thinking on things in ways that can produce just way better results. So if you're able to leverage the other people around you to improve your thinking, you often just get way better plans and execution than you ever would get if you're off in your own spoke doing it individually. And I guess this has shaped my thinking over the last couple of years. I've started to really look at leadership teams in terms of the quality of the decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was curious about how you evaluate the quality of decision making, or how you consciously improve the quality of discourse and critique within leadership teams.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a very before you even want to evaluate the quality of the decision making of a team, you first have to evaluate, are there decisions being made, period.
Totally.
I think I do believe that like the quality of both a leader or a team is really about the quality of decisions being made. And I think it's really important to keep a list of what those are. And that could be decisions made around solving a problem or whatever it is. But if you are getting towards the end of your week and you look back and you don't have like a handful of like really difficult and meaningful decisions that you've made, like you're probably not, for something's probably not set up right. And I think sometimes people will say I delegate the decisions down to the team and they make the decisions, and that could be true and they're probably making great decisions, but what that means as a leader is that you aren't solving the most important problems, because what is the point of you if you're not like in a position where you have to make the final call because a bunch of people are disagreeing on something, honestly. And so I think that is a really good metric, is just like, are decisions being made? And in terms of the quality of the decisions, I think it's a really hard thing to evaluate in the moment, I think that's a pretty lagging indicator. And depending on what you're trying to do, the way that those decisions play out might take a few days, a few weeks, maybe even like a year or two. But I think that also goes back to the earlier question around how do you think about how to hire, or what do you look for when you're hiring a leader? And I think one big piece of it is somebody who's made a lot of decisions that have proven to be the right ones over time. And I think I think that's part of the reason, counter to a lot of people in the tech industry, I really, I value people who've been at the same organization for a long time. I think especially when you're higher up in an organization, if you're changing jobs every like year or two, the impact of the decisions you're making isn't really even playing out. But when you're in your position for many years, I mean, you just simply can't stay in a position in a long time in our industry and not be somebody who has made like a lot of the right decisions over a long period of time.
And conversely, you could look back and realize all the poor decisions you made, but you get to see them and learn from them.
Absolutely. What I always think is funny is when I will reflect back on the year, like there's always either a few decisions or a few actions that I took that just probably delivered 90% of the value that I delivered that year.
Yeah.
And there really are like these, just like these big, always like these big major moments, but you need some distance to know what they are.
One thing you seem to be good at is working with different skill sets on a leadership team, or different cross-functional specialties within a leadership team. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you've come to think about working in cross-functional groups where the people have wildly different skill sets?
Yeah, I think first off, I think throughout my career, I've had a lot of different jobs. And so I would say I spent the bulk of my time doing software engineering, but, you know, also a lot of other roles as well. And I spent my early career at startups where you're doing just a ton of different things. I think actually a lot of my thinking around teams and working together with different people is actually has actually been informed by my experience playing music in bands, and the idea of you've got different instruments, they all have a different job, a different skill set, and you're coming together in a collaborative way to create a song. And it's not usually not totally consensus based. You know, there's usually somebody who has the strongest opinion, but everyone's opinionated. And I think it's like from that basis of playing music and playing together with groups of people and playing music, I think that I really brought a lot of that kind of early on in my career. And when I was talking earlier about what are the most important problems to solve for the company, I think that's something you have to think about a lot. And when you think in that way, the things that are the most important, often they almost always need a lot of different skill sets. Even if you're limiting yourself to just engineering, to build, I mean, the most innovative products and features that I've built have been teams with like wildly diverse skill sets, you know, designers, front-end engineers, back-end engineers. I think I always think to really build the best products, you have to pull together a pretty diverse group of people. And when you're solving company problems, it's the same thing. Problems that can be solved easily by a very small group of people that report to a certain manager, those problems have already probably been solved. Maybe not, but they probably have been. And so you have to almost always, in my experience, pull from people outside of your own team to really make the most progress on things. And I think people can sometimes be tentative to do that. Like I talk about this and people will be like, well, like there's only one person who can do something and they report to somebody else. And my answer is just like, go talk to them, see if they want to help out on this. And it's like they'll really you'll get a good response. They will be excited. You'll get something done that people have known as a problem for a while and haven't worked on it. And maybe sometimes that approach goes wrong, but I think it goes right more often than not.
I really like the music metaphor because just assembling a group of people from a lot of different skill sets, you sometimes won't have that skill set yourself. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what it takes to create something great, part of it is taste. Mm-hmm. Like you have to have really good taste because there's actually this conflict sometimes between specialty skill sets and your own sense of taste, where the expert might be saying, this is the way to do it. And yet what you want to create demands something different from you. And that can be a challenging place to be in as a leader, I think. How have you navigated that?
I love the concept of taste, and I'm kicking myself for not saying that when I was talking about what I look for when I hire. But I think taste, for lack of a better word, is really such a key skill for a leader. And it's not just about hearing from them about what product they built. You have to go use it. And for lack of it, it's just, you have to be, is it good? Does it does it have taste? There's probably like a list of more objective ways to evaluate that. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, you're looking for people who have good taste and can build good products, or they have like good taste in what works for an organization, so they can build good teams. But if you've only had experience like working at a company that like builds terrible products, like how are you? It's really hard to develop that taste. Or if you've only worked at companies that are just incredibly dysfunctional organizationally, it's hard to have the taste of like, this is what good looks like. And so, yeah, I think taste is a very important thing that my objective mind always pushes back on it a little bit, but I actually think it's really important.
I know what you mean about the objective mind part, because it's also it can be hard to evaluate. It seems unfair to critique somebody for the place that they came from, because I have seen very talented people with excellent taste coming from very dysfunctional places or places with poor product. But it's a little bit more the exception. So separating those is sometimes difficult.
Yeah, and it's hard when and you like maybe use a product that they built and you're like, oh, this is terrible. And it's just I think when you're experienced, like you have this intuitive gut feeling, which is like an emotional reaction to something that you're seeing, but it is actually informed by a lot of trial and error, even if like you consciously can't, separate every single part that goes into it. And I think with management and leadership, it's always a balance of trusting your intuition, but also being analytical and objective as well. There's times for both.
For sure. Earlier, you mentioned the Founder Mode article by Paul Graham. I thought it might be interesting to dig into that a little bit before we close out today.
Oh, yeah.
So I think we both agreed that the advice to hire people and then get out of their way was really terrible advice for all leaders in general.
I think that's like the number one reason people get fired is it's like, if you ever hear somebody say, I'm here, like, I just hired great people and I let them do what they do, I always think to myself, well, that person's going to end up losing their job at some point.
Yeah. Like it can work for a while, but it's not. Yeah,
exactly.
What I thought was weird about his post was that he seemed to think that that was bad advice for founders and that it was good advice for professional managers. And I couldn't understand why anybody would think it was good advice for anybody.
Yeah, I think that is part of my feedback around the article. But in some ways, I think he's right. Like the behaviors that he's talking about are more common around founders. It's like a stereotype, I guess. Like, you know, if you're
Yeah.
gonna have a stereotype of somebody who like hires good people and just lets them drag the company into oblivion, like you imagine like a big company person. And if your stereotype of somebody who's like really into the weeds and into the details is more of a founder. And certainly I think the founders that we both have worked with in the past are very much in that mode. But yeah, I think there's no reason, like every manager should be in that mode, in my opinion.
Yes. I
Like,
totally agree.
yeah, and there's like a balance to it for sure. But I think that's definitely one of my takeaways from the article. The other thing that I kind of, when I was reading that article too, I kind of jokingly thought it could also have been titled like neurodivergent mode. So you have like neurodivergent mode and neurotypical mode. And it's like 60 or 70% of like entrepreneurs and founders are neurodivergent. And what does a neurodivergent person do? Speaking as somebody with that, it's like dig into the details, like know exactly how everything works. And then you have like a neurotypical mode of like, you know, and so I thought like that was a kind of a funny thing about that. Like it's describing almost like a different personality type almost, as opposed to just like the founder role.
I love that. That's really funny. I guess the other thing that I would say is my critique of that post was I've actually seen a lot of startups where the founders don't engage in management and don't really learn to actually create any sort of system for scaling their company beyond themselves. Mm-hmm. And they're like, founder mode works if the founders have a really good sense of the trade-offs of getting into the details with things, or micromanaging in some cases, or like understanding when to intervene and when to do things more indirectly. And I guess I just see a very common failure mode in startups where the founders don't ever learn how to step back, mm-hmm. especially early on. And so I worried that some of that advice seemed actually harmful for a lot of founders.
Yeah. And I think like another way to think about it too is you could also call it like problem solving mode, where I think that is, you know, the only approach that I've ever seen have any kind of impact in both like innovation and problem solving and like changing things. But you should never be in a mode as a company where everything needs that. If something's like working well, you can put the manager mode type person to lead that and keep it very stable. In fact, having the opposite, having a founder mode person on something that is working well, will almost certainly blow it up.
Yes,
because it goes both ways. It's like this kind of mode of working. It has like both. It has it's positive. It has a positive on the long tail, but also positive on the negative tail as well. So it's going to either make something a lot better or just have it completely collapse. And so you don't want to apply that on things that are working pretty well. You only want to apply that in areas where like a significant positive outcome can really move the needle on the business.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. Any other thoughts on founder mode?
No, I really did like that article. And I remember seeing Paul Graham speak to like very few people at a bookstore in Portland when his book Hackers and Painters came out. And I just love that book. And I never would have thought he would blow up in the way he did back then. But yeah, I've always enjoyed his essays.
I think he does a really good job of naming things and bringing up points in ways that really resonate with people.
Absolutely.
And
yeah,
he's so good at that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. Alex, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been a lot of fun. We've gotten to talk shop, and I love catching up, and I love talking leadership with you. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on the show. And I've really I really loved what you're doing with it. I think you've invited some great people and like some really great topics are covered. Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'll see you next time.